Alright, so I apply adhesive to the leather. And the leather's pretty good at soaking it up. And spread that out evenly with a toothpick, making sure that all the edges in particular get to see the adhesive. And just push that down into place. Now that's a Zeiss bump there, which may or may not lie flat in the fullness of time. Just rub that in, any excess squeeze out, get it off while it's still soft and tacky. That looks good. Now, to go on there, we have our tripod socket surround. Now you may remember that it only had one screw and it had been glued in position. Well, it was worse than I thought, because the one screw had been sheared off. That was broken. That wasn't actually holding anything. The glue was holding everything. The screws were this one screw was holding nothing at all. So I've got to find two screws to do this job. And as I probably already previously mentioned, I don't have any. I can cut down a screw from a Retina IIa type camera to do that job. I'll have to sort that out now. I've just screwed that in position. I did explain all about that while I was doing it, but unfortunately the video camera was fast asleep. But that part's done. They were two shortened screws that originally began their life with the Retina IIa and just had to be filed short. If you use the screws from the 3C, they would foul that rewind catch, and that wouldn't work correctly. So we need to move to the top of the camera and start assembling things. And I'm going to start with the rewind because that's simple. So a little bit of synthetic grease on the inner part of our rewind. This has a little detent spring on it which stops it from flapping about in the breeze. Just make sure that slides all the way up. That went smoothly. And here's the bush that holds the rewind to the top of the camera body. I'm just giving that a fairly generous wipe with synthetic grease. You could use graphite grease, you could use just about anything in that position. It is not critical at all. I'll just use the tip of my screwdriver to hold that, lift that clip very slightly to allow me to get this over the end of the shaft. And that's it. Make sure that moves smoothly enough. It doesn't have to be rattling around exactly loose. It just needs to be able to turn without too much resistance. If it was very stiff, then when you advance the film would be under quite a deal of tension, and that would stress the film and might cause you problems. But that would have to be exceptionally stiff to do that. Right, 3 screws are in place, so I can tighten them up. That was the rewind, that was easy. Now the film advance stuff, let's get that sorted out. The first task at the top of the film advance mechanism is to get the clutch back together. So I lubricate this with graphite grease. For much the same reason I lubricate the film advance shaft with graphite grease. I like the feel of it. Now this spring has to go together. Little tab on the top of that, it must fit into that notch. And I usually hold this in a pair of crimp lug pliers, roll it round to pull that spring in, put it down on the bench, put the outer over the top, press down. Here's my clutch assembled. Moves nice and smooth in one direction, not so much in the other. the smooth direction is the right direction, so there's no problem there. Put some synthetic grease through the centre of that, drop it on the top, rotate it until it drops into the film cassette cartridge, the take-up spool. Here we have the bush. Now there are two gear sets on here, pinions that are linked top and bottom, excuse me. Squeeze a bit of grease into those, run some through the centre for good measure. Put that on the camera body. Now if you revolve the sprocket shaft, you'll see it engages this gear. If you revolve the take-up spool, you'll see it engages the front gear. That, when it's engaged, it means that that'll tighten up nicely. You won't have any fights. If it's not engaged, you may be sitting on top of the gear, not side by side with the teeth engaged. So make sure that those things revolve smoothly before you do these screws up. Before I tighten those up, check that everything moves smoothly. That all looks good. And start assembling some of the rest of this stuff. Again with the synthetic grease, so I'll just run some underneath that face, some underneath the bottom there. Now this gear actually links those two shafts together, so you'll see as you revolve one, the other revolves as well. Now there's a little pawl that goes on there, and the spring was somewhat mutilated when we started, so we'll be putting, I'll just put that spacer there, put the pawl in place. Here's the screw, that the shaft that holds all that in place, that it pivots around. See if I can get this screwed down. Now I've got to get its spring in position. Now the spring was somewhat mutilated and needed to be straightened out. Get that over the head of that screw. Without it disappearing off into the wilderness in the traditional fashion. This spring normally stays with the screw. It's not one that's prone to come adrift by itself. And lift that spring over and hook it into that notch on the back of that lever, like that. Do it like that. So as that film advance moves, that ratchet ensures that that shaft can't turn backwards. That was not happening earlier because the spring was mutilated and it wasn't correctly positioned. Surprise, surprise with this camera. As a spring goes on the top here, oh, hang on, we're missing something. Take the spring off. This little drive dog goes on the top there. Now I might give that a wipe with synthetic grease since I've got it here. That doesn't need much. The spring sits on top of that, and this piece here with the ratchets top and bottom goes on there, and I'm just trying to get a feel of where the neutral position, about there. That's about the right position. I know that this slot here angled at this direction, when that's there, that gives me appropriate return spring on the film advance lever. It returns to the rest position smoothly without any fights and without over tensioning things. So that's sitting there. Is that engaged? Looks good. Now this dog here that runs on the ratchet and ensures that the action of the film advance moves correctly. Has a return spring underneath the base of it and sits right here. Now that's all held down in position with this bracket, and this bracket has a gear on the riveted to it, and I want to force a bit of grease in there, so I'll just put some on the top and press down on it, and the hydraulic pressure will force that grease in around the shaft, and that's all that's required. So this goes on the top of the body. You need to make sure that it sits on top of this lever, not behind it or anywhere else. And there are 3 screws that hold this together, 2 plain ones, one at the end here. These screws are mutilated. They've been gnawed off by a trained rat. They're flaming ugly. The one here has a spring on it, and that's a shoulder screw. We'll get to that in a second. We're going to get the other plain screw down at this corner. Getting this one in position is always entertaining because you haven't got much room to move. And this screw head, honestly, I don't know what someone was doing. If it was any uglier, it would be unusable, but it's not quite at that stage. Run that screw down, snug its mate down slightly. Now there's a return spring and a shoulder screw here. That return spring is a really strange shape. Avoid the temptation to make it look pretty by squaring things up. It's not supposed to be squared up. It's supposed to be an ugly shape. Don't muck around with it unless you really know what you're doing, because you will end up with something that doesn't work. Those 3 screws I can do up tight. This spring, first I had to press this lever as far down as it goes, lift that spring over behind it, and now it has some spring tension in this direction. Right, that's looking pretty good. Where's the gear for the top of that shaft? Is it here? Yes, it is. I'm just looking at that. I think that's alright. A lot of the stuff is a little bit scarred and unhappy looking, but you know, if it's just surface marks, that's fine. I was just concerned that might have been more than just a surface mark on that gear. Right, if that's revolved to there, 1 full turn, and the film advance lever was sitting in position, if we press this button down here, we can revolve that round a 1/4 of a turn, and shortly we'll be able to insert the shutter cocking rack. Now the shutter cocking rack on a Retina IIa camera, if you don't know, is exceptionally robust. Never ever had a problem with strength, stripping teeth or anything like that, although you will find people who will tell you that they're terrible and that they failed and all the rest of it. It's a load of crap. That was later cameras and they were different racks. Right, there we go, that's in. Shutter cocking rack's in, all correctly positioned. Film advance will probably work quite nicely there. What's next? Oh, we'll put all the film advance stuff on here, make that work. We had we had this, yes, of course it needed a new one of these. That's our counter spring, our frame counter pawl or spring, and our other components have been cleaned and just need to be reassembled really. In fact, some of these components have been cleaned twice. Let's get this assembled, bit of grease there, get this in place, and you can probably see that scratch here. See that show? Yeah, you can. That points to where number 1 needs to be. Opposite that scratch on the other side is where the cutout is here that engages that end of film stop. But that scratch mark there, that was used pretty much from the earliest days of Retina IIas. Probably as a convenience for people assembling these cameras in the factory. Making sure I've got that the right way round. That all looks good. Put this piece in position. The wavy washer. Apply some synthetic grease to that, which lubricates it, and it also helps hold it all together while you're getting all this in position, because it's always a hassle to get it in position. Right, everything's ready. Swing that onto there, line it up with that pin, revolve this clockwise, do all the clicks click. That feels good. The star washer, the pinhead screw. Let's get this done up. Before I tighten it up, make sure everything's clicking as it should. That seems good. Check that the frame count is working. It is, and the action is smooth and it returns to the rest position correctly. Shutter release next, I think, and the shutter release, need to gather these components together. We had a return spring, the main shutter release shaft, the collar that limits the travel, the shutter release button. The collar off the top of the shutter release button was absolutely essential, and there's that spacer from the shutter release that would make that action work correctly. Oh, you can see bugger all of it. Okay, let's move this down a bit here. Here we go. So, what are we going to do? Well, again, a bit of synthetic grease helps here to hold things together. So I'll just put a spot on there and slide that collar on, and it won't fall off. I'm going to put this, let's check that, make sure that there's no moisture in there, because all these parts have been cleaned and supposedly dried. I'm just going to put some synthetic, some molybdenum paste through the centre there to lubricate that. I'm going to put a smear right on the end, and on that end I will stick that shim washer. I'll put the spring on the shutter release shaft there, and then I'm going to get this into the camera without losing that washer. That's the idea. And I did it earlier today, so it's certainly possible. Oh, it's falling off there. It's a pretty neat fit in that hole. it doesn't want to go through smoothly. There are other ways to do this. I can take the door off. I might do that. Let's take the door off. I don't want to lose that washer or think that I've got it in position when it's not in position. So I'll just close this part way, remove that top pivot screw. I'm not going to remove the bottom pivot screw. I'm going to get the door off without doing that. Pull that forward, lift the door off the pin at the bottom. Now we had a washer in there, spacer washer, that's still present. I'll put that to one side. My shutter release, to get this washer back from where it's currently wedged in. I'll put that directly on the shaft here. Drop my shutter release in from the top, like that. So my spacer washer, you can see where it fits in here. Now, I want to get my door swung back in position. This is tricky because we're wriggling stuff that's not really designed to be wriggled that way. Let's get that washer in place, get that door, get screw in its, where's the hole? Oh, it's way down there. Okay, that's in. Get the door closed, make sure we haven't disturbed their shutter release, that's good, and get the pivot pin for the door at the top in place. It's all fighting with the springs at the moment. Let's just get this screw in place. Done. So we have our shutter release in place, the washer's in place. On top of the shutter release shaft we have the shutter release button, and that has a little collar that sits on top of it. And that collar is essential because if that collar is missing, what can happen is that when the shutter release rises up, it can rotate so that this pin is no longer lined up with the guide hole, and therefore the shutter release cannot be depressed and you end up with a camera that acts like it's jammed. And so that collar is absolutely essential. It prevents the shutter release from rising too far. That's all good. All that mechanism is in place now, and really the camera body here wants the rangefinder fitted. To fit the rangefinder I normally put a couple of spots of lacquer, cheap $1 shop nail varnish stuff. Not your wife's best nail varnish, you won't like it. Put a couple of spots on there, and what this does, it means that if the camera gets a thump at a later date, that rangefinder is not likely to shift. Because it's not dowelled into position, it's only held in with 2 screws. There's a little bit of wriggle room there, and you can rest assured that if you drop the camera, inertia will certainly make sure that the rangefinder keeps moving after the camera body stops, and your rangefinder will no longer be accurate. These lined up with a screw hole will be doing very well. That's one. This is something you get good at with practice, is dropping screws in from a great height and have them land in the hole. Sometimes it happens first hit, and sometimes it doesn't. Now normally I press the rangefinder body right back hard against those two screws, square with the body, so that I've got a good fixed reference point. Tighten the two screws up. Now I want to check the alignment of my rangefinder. And the horizontal alignment's pretty good. My vertical alignment is out. Of course, we've had this off the camera body, and things have, we probably shifted things when we mucked with the door. That would have changed the height of that front standard and may have shifted things here. Too low, right. And here I'm just making adjustments to get the horizontal alignment correct. That's pretty good, it's a bit low. I'm adjusting the position of the moving image. It needs to come up a bit more. That's very good. I'm very happy with that. That rangefinder looks spot on. Well, at this stage I need to clean up my top cover, because I can't really go any further with this until I've got that all sorted out. So where is the top cover? Here it is. Let's have a look at it, and we'll take this shoe off for a start. This is all pretty dirty. That screw was loose, the other two were okay. And this mask at the front holds the glass in for the two windows at the front of the top cover. So I'll lift these two, get these two screws out, and we'll lift the glass out. Yeah, the glass is actually stuck in here with dirt and grease. There's our glass and other bits and pieces. And here is the top cover. Do not be tempted to try and unscrew that eyepiece there. It doesn't unscrew, it's staked in. Every now and then you get cameras that people have put a pair of pliers on that and given it a wee twist to try and unscrew that. It's not how it goes together. So cleaning the glass in that back windows can certainly be done. It's a bit fiddly, it's possibly less than ideal, but it can be done satisfactorily. This top cover, let's see if we can get rid of some of this filth with a bit of naphtha. You can see the state of that. And all this is accumulated grime, skin oils from handling, anything else that could possibly get on you. Environmental contaminants, you know, cigarette smoke, all that sort of stuff. If it's been sitting somewhere where there's a lot of soot and things settling on things, that can certainly build up on it. So I want all of this nice and clean, because I'm going to be putting the clean glass back in there shortly. And the last thing you need is to take a nice clean piece of glass and wipe it across some dirty greasy surface and have to start all over again. Now, yeah, you can see it there. There's a depression here. That's where the camera's been dropped, and that's where the accessory shoe has dented the top cover. It's only a very minor dent, you wouldn't notice that, and it won't cause us any problems. But those sorts of things are interesting to see when people tell you to all know they've the camera's always been babied and it's never been dropped, and you have a look at them sometimes and they're all over dents and bent pieces. Get these 3 chromed screws back in position. To clean that rear viewfinder window, what I normally do is put a touch of glass cleaner on a cotton bud, feed it through from the front, swirl it backwards and forwards, put the dry end in, swirl that backwards and forwards, and that should clean the inside surface. Now basically do the same thing for the outside surface. And check the result. That looks good. So that's nice and clean, easy to see out of. That's just exactly what we want. And these filthy pieces of glass here, I'll show you that against a white piece of paper. Just wait. Now you can see that they're not exactly transparent. There's a lot of filth on there. Well, all of that's got to come off. That's quite normal, but it's very, very grimy. It's normal to have a couple of goes at cleaning glass like this, because you can see the filth that comes off it. It's finger grease, all the stuff that's on the top cover. So as you can see, I'm manipulating this with my fingers, so I'm wiping my own finger grease and rubbish all over it as I go. But that's only minor compared to the baked on grime that's on this glass. So I've got to go around the edges because the edges are very grimy. And if you don't get all of that grime off around the edges, you'll find that it will either seep back round to where you don't want to see it of its own accord, or it'll otherwise just cause you grief. Right, that looks quite good. I'm going to clean those now on a cloth and we should be able to put them back.